Good evening. It is time for us to begin our Bible study. We'll be in John chapter 4 here in just a moment. John chapter 4. Before we do that, let's go to God in prayer. God and Father in heaven, we are thankful for the day we have, this time in which we can come and study from this word. We ask, Father, that we will open our eyes and our minds to what you have revealed, that we might be strengthened, that we might in turn shine brighter in this world, that more will see your glory and more will come into the kingdom. Father, we ask your continued blessings on all of us and the world at this time, that you will allow the recovery, if it be your will, that we will be able to get back to some normalcy of life, and that many will get past this sickness. We ask all these things through your Son's name. Amen. John chapter 4, we began to look at it on Sunday, and we looked and got down through about verse 42. This is the account of the conversion of the Samaritan woman at the well, and then those of the city of Sychar that was quite nearby. And we see an important idea of personal evangelism that comes out of this. And we want to look at the principles of that we see in this evening. 7 different principles of personal evangelism. The first one is one that's going to seem strange in the world conditions that we have right now, where we have everything from social distancing to stay at home, don't go anywhere, to lockdowns. The first principle of personal evangelism that we see within this context, we have to have social contact. We have to contact people socially. Social contact, look at Jesus passing through Samaria in verses 1 through 6. And you see that he stops at Jacob's well. He sits down and he meets a woman. This is the picture of what we have. People aren't going to be coming to Christ. It's because we're not going to the people. They're not going to really, while there will be the occasional, and there are people that are interested in Jesus that will show up at the door, in the greatest case, it's because we've contacted them. We can't be, as one would say, fishers of men by fishing in a barrel either. If the fish won't come to the barrel, then we've got to go where the fish are. And so there is this problem. But we shouldn't confuse this idea of separation with isolation. Unfortunately, in the world today, right now, we have this idea of social distancing, isolation. Stay away from anybody else and make sure you don't, you have to wear a mask and this and that and the other. We're going to get past that. We can get past it in other ways even today. We have to be separate from the world. In other words, we have to live differently. We have to live the way that Christ puts forth, but we cannot isolate ourselves. In fact, look a little later in John. Go to John 17. Jesus is going to be saying a prayer here. John 17, down at verse 15. In this prayer, Jesus says, I pray not that thou shouldst take them out of the world, but that thou shouldst keep them from the evil. In other words, we can't be taken out of the world, but we can be protected from the evil. And this is the picture we have, that we have to practice this idea of socially getting people. Think about some opportunities. It's going to come about again. It's starting now. There's been some relief on some of the quarantining, but think about the opportunities we have for social contact, even in the quarantine as it was. But at school, young people, we're going to go back to school. It's going to open. They're going to get there. But even before that, if you know them, there's no reason why we can't share it now through the electronic means of social contact and telephone calls and cards and letters and all these different ways that we can do things that relate to this. A second one, at work. Most businesses are now back open. There's no reason why we cannot share this idea with those at work. Now, you have to be somewhat considerate of how we do it on occasion, and maybe we have to do it a little different. But I tell you what, the lifestyle we live at work can do as much as anything else. You think about it at home with your neighbors, your family, your friends. Even in this time where we're locked down, you can see people that need to know the gospel. And so social contact, one of the primary things we begin to see. The second principle that we see of this idea of personal evangelism here is Jesus is practicing it. Establish a common interest. Establish a common interest. Look what happens. Jesus had to travel. His disciples have gone into the city to buy food. He's sitting at the well there in verse 6. At verse 7 and 8, notice what happens. There cometh a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus saith unto her, Give me to drink. For his disciples were gone away unto the city to buy meat. There was a common interest. She had come to draw water. He was thirsty. His first words centered around that common interest, the water. Realize the need to build rapport, in other words, to have a discussion with someone. It's got to have something that makes you have a common point, at least common interest. And it can, we'll notice from Jesus, there's a bridge to go from talking about water to talking about spiritual living. And he's going to show us part of that. But common interests we can develop with someone. They can include family, children or grandchildren, or activities, work, community projects, hobbies, football, if it, we'll get there. It'll be here this fall. Shared experiences, travel, maybe even tragedies. Hey, there is a common point of interest all of us have in this nation right now. There's a common point we can all work from. So establish a common interest. It's how Jesus practices it. As you go on, a third personal evangelism point here. Arouse spiritual interest. Now this starts, as we mentioned, with work, how we act, how we live. Through your actions. The example of Jesus. Look at verse 9. Jesus has been sitting there. She's come to the well. He's asked her for water. Verse 9, Then saith the woman of Samaria unto him, How is it that thou, being a Jew, ask me a drink of me, which am a woman of Samaria? For the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans. As a man, he speaks to her, a woman. There was one point that was strange in that day. A second one, as a rabbi, he speaks to her, an immoral woman. Why would anybody want to talk to that? And then third, as a Jew, he speaks to her, a Samaritan. He aroused interest by simply speaking to her. Unfortunately, I think many times we miss contacts because we think somebody wouldn't be interested, rather than opening the door and allowing them to make the choice. So regarding our actions around this, we can arouse spiritual interest by our own example, by showing kindness and compassion to everyone, whether they're evil or wicked, whether they're living in sin, a flat-out violation of God's will. If they're hungry, if they're sick, if they're in need, it may be an open door. It's their choice, but are we providing the opportunity? By not harboring things that are big in this world at times, maybe racial or social prejudices to those who are different. It may not be as much racial any longer as it is the social kinds. You're not the same as me. Maybe it's you don't have as much money as I do. You don't work at the place I work. You don't have the same educational background. None of that should matter, whether it's the skin color, whether it's the country you're from, whether it's the language you speak, whether it's the amount of money we have, the job we have, the education, none of that matters in terms of getting to heaven. And so by our own example of faith and hope, think about what Peter would say in 1 Peter 3, 1 and 2, and down into 15, where he talks about having that example, and that example should bring forth questions. What happened here at this well? Think about the case again. You've had Jesus who was traveling. They've had to take a break. His disciples are gone to get food. Jesus is tired. He sits down. A woman comes. She's going to draw water. He is thirsty. We have a common point of interest. I'd like a drink of water. Just by opening up that question to her, you see his thought, that action that comes through. So through your actions, but also through your words. Look at the example of Jesus as he goes on. Verses 10 through 14 as we go back through John 4. Jesus answered and said unto her, If thou knewest the gift of God, and who it was that saith to thee, Give me to drink, thou wouldst have asked of him, and he would have given thee living water. The woman saith unto him, Sir, thou hast nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. From whence then hast thou that living water? Art thou greater than our father Jacob, which gave us the well, and drank thereof himself, and his children, and his cattle? Jesus answered and said unto her, Whosoever drinketh of this water shall thirst again. But whosoever drinketh of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst. But the water that I shall give him shall be in him a well of water springing up into everlasting life. Jesus turns this common point of interest, water, from that physical action into spiritual matters. He led them into a discussion on a common spiritual interest, living water. Regarding our words, think about it. We can raise questions or make statements that could shift a conversation to spiritual matters, or things like even a simple question. What do you think why our world is in such a mess? Or would you be interested in what the Bible says about? Now, a lot of people get turned off when they hear that particular one, but if you time it right and they've talked and looked at it, all of a sudden it becomes open. And so the discussion should start, it should first involve matters of common interest. Start with things upon which you agree. Build rapport and instill confidence. And this was how the apostles continued the practice. You look at the example of Paul and Barnabas in Acts chapter 13, verses 16 through 22. They did the same style and thing. And so once that spiritual interest has now been aroused, we go on to the fourth principle. Don't go too far, too fast. This is probably one of the things that hurts us in terms of our own understanding of spiritual matters, as well as trying to talk with someone. We hear somebody say, I want to know about Jesus, and straight down is where we're going to go. What we need to do is give the person what they're ready for. Sometimes we need to realize that in our own. I may not be ready to go all the way in depth in this. I need to start here and then work my way into it. They need to start where they're at and be led into it. Note how Jesus did this. Verses 15 and 16. You notice, the woman saith unto her, Sir, give me this water that I thirst not, neither come hither to draw. Jesus saith unto her, Go call thy husband and come hither. Jesus sees she wants the living water, but she didn't really understand the spiritual context of it yet. He saw the need to slow her down. And sometimes I think that's the problem. We get people, they want to get into deep questions when we haven't gotten into the shallow water yet. This is what Jesus is showing. It's time to slow down. We need to get the proper groundwork. She needed to have faith in him as the Messiah, and he needed to provide evidence that he was the Messiah. So instead of going straight into giving her the living water, he tells her, go get your husband, which will result, because he knows more than we ever would. You can see this is not an easy thing to do sometimes. He already knew her situation, and he knows that the answers in the discussion now will result in her conviction of him as a prophet. Unfortunately, many people, to give an idea of what happens, they want to go study the book of Revelation, but yet they haven't studied the book of Genesis yet. They haven't studied the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, and on through in-depthly yet. They haven't looked at books like Ezekiel and Daniel and gotten and studied the idea of talking in apocalyptic literature with signs and symbols. But we want to go study Revelation. And that is where we need to slow people down. It would be if we got outside the realm of the Bible for a moment and went to the realm of math. It would be like trying to study Calculus 3 without having taken trig, geometry, or algebra. You took basic math, you learned 1 + 1 = 2. I'm ready to go start Calculus 3. It's laughable, but people try to do that in religion. And so we need to be grounded with the rest of the Bible first. It's not that we don't need to study those books, but we need to sometimes get some basis to do that first. Another example, don't go too far too fast. Some want to discuss issues that are related to church organization, its work, its worship, when they ought to focus on the first principles of the gospel. Now, part of the worship is first principles. You cannot separate the teaching of the church from the idea of the teaching of the gospel. But at the same time, there are certain things we need to put until later. It's not going to matter until you can become a Christian, until you understand what God wants you to do first. You really can't do second. And that's the whole picture that Jesus is trying to put forth. You notice she's ready to go. Give me the living water. And Jesus says, well, slow down a moment. Go get your husband. He doesn't do that because the need of a man there. He does it to slow her down, and knowing the rest of the story, he knows what it's going to prove to her. Sometimes we need to remember how to do this. We need to slow someone down. Give it a little time. Maybe we see a point where they're having frustration. We need to be able and willing to have the patience to say, why don't we stop for a little while? Chew on that tonight. Let's get back together tomorrow night or the next night, or maybe let's take a 15-minute break sometimes is all that's needed. Something to slow it down and let that person get grounded to where they need to be. It's important in our lives sometimes. There are times when we just need to set the book down and step away from it for a moment to get a clear thought as we're studying on our own. A fifth idea, a fifth principle that we see Jesus bring about here in this book and in this chapter: don't condemn unnecessarily. Look at verses 17 and 18 to start with. The woman answered and said, I have no husband. Jesus said unto her, Thou hast well said, I have no husband, for thou hast had 5 husbands, and he whom thou now hast is not thy husband. In that thou said truly. He could have dwelt on her being an adulteress. He could have taken that and just gone all the way through it. But Jesus didn't do that. Remember his mission. If we stay with John to give the theory for this and the theme, go back to chapter 3. Look at verse 17, not verse 16 like most people would go, but look at verse 17. Why did God send Jesus into the world? For God sent not his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. Now, by default, that's going to condemn a lot of people because there's something to be saved from. And if you don't do what Jesus wants you to do, how can he save you from it? So there is a condemnation there, but that's not his purpose. He came to save the world. The best example I can give is, you think about preachers and what they go through and try to learn, and it can be real easy to do the following. Say, and I actually had someone while I was in school that began a Wednesday night devotional this way: you're going to hell. What did that automatically do to everybody sitting there? Now, his purpose was to say, unless, but if you're on the receiving end of that, as they would say in Star Trek, the shields go up and that's it. You're not getting through to that person any longer. If Jesus had concentrated on that, he used what he needed from it because he needed to bring into her the conviction that he was the Messiah, a prophet. And he used that because he didn't know who she was. He'd never seen her before, at least in her mind. She had never seen him before. How could he know anything about me? He's a Jew, I'm a Samaritan. We have no dealings. There's no common ground. All we're interested in together right now is a drink of water. and yet he can tell me that the man I have right now is not my husband, and I had 5 before that, that he uses that in a different way, but he doesn't condemn. Not to say he will not one day judge the world either. Look over to John to keep that in mind. John chapter 12, verses 46 through 48. Jesus says there, I am come a light into the world, that whosoever believeth on me should not abide in darkness. And if any man hear my words and believe not, I judge him not, for I came not to judge the world, but to save the world. He that rejecteth me and receiveth not my words hath one that judgeth him. The word that I have spoken, the same shall judge him in the last day. So yes, there is a condemnation, but that's not his primary purpose. Primary purpose is to save. Unfortunately, we are human. We have a tendency to do this. In our evangelistic efforts, when we start to want to talk to someone, we begin to assume, oh, look how bad a life they have. Look how they've lived. And when we preach against sin and when we live against sin, we have to be careful that it's clear that it's the sin that we're in condemning, that we're not against people. Our focus, in fact, should be to inform others of the forgiveness of God. That way they understand what God offers. God seeks reconciliation with sinners. The only reason we need to identify sin to them is so they know they're in sin. Now, how do you do that, and how do you keep it where you're not condemning one? That's the key. You want to condemn actions. You want to condemn those things, not the person. So we need to preach reconciliation, that yes, one can be in a terrible place, but thanks to God, one can be in a great place. I've used the example before in sermons, and I'll give it here, but think about what God did if we were to put it in maybe terms we understand. Football's not on right now, but football will be coming back in the fall. You go out and you buy the brand new, what are we up to, about 65, 70-inch TVs that are getting to be affordable. You buy the brand new, spanking new 70-inch TV so you can watch football. You get it into the house, you have it set up. You haven't gotten it fully mounted yet maybe, but in comes the young child. Maybe he's 5, 6, whatever. He's got the ball and he starts throwing it in the house, even though he's been told not to. The ball hits the TV falls over, it shatters. Can this 5 or 6-year-old even think of being able to afford and provide restitution of that which was broke? No, what's going to happen if you, say, being the father, want to watch that football on that TV, you're going to have to go out and buy another TV. The goal may be to bring it in and have the child give it to you so he gets some idea that he has to do something, but you had to pay the whole price. Think about God and the reason we shouldn't condemn unnecessarily, and that we need to talk about reconciliation. God created a whole world and universe for man, put man on that planet, gave man everything he needed, and asked man to do 3 things. To populate the earth, to take care for the garden, and don't eat of that one tree. Everything else was wide open. What does man do in very short order? And yet man cannot buy himself out of that. Man couldn't do anything about it once it happened. It took God to repay himself with the price. And that's the picture we see. Jesus comes being that price, and he teaches not to condemn, but to try to save. Now, is that going to condemn? Yes, but it's all about how we do that. Another item as we come through these idea of evangelistic principles. We've seen that we ought to contact people socially. We need to know them. We need to establish a common interest. We need to arouse spiritual interest. Don't go too far too fast. Don't condemn unnecessarily. Number 6, probably one that we quite often have a problem. Stick with the main issue. Stick with the main issue. Think about the example we have here in John 4. Go to verses 19 and 20 now. The woman saith unto him, Sir, I perceive that thou art a prophet. Our fathers worshipped in this mountain, and you say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. The Samaritan woman, she turned the subject away from herself to where one should worship. She saw things. You're a prophet. You know things. What about worship? We've been taught we're to worship on this mountain. You think it's down in Jerusalem. Jesus answers her questions, but effectively turns the conversation back to the original subject, who he is and what he offers. Look at verses 21 through 25 here in a moment for that answer. Verses 21 through 25, Jesus saith unto her, Woman, believe me, the hour cometh when ye shall neither in this mountain nor yet at Jerusalem worship the Father. Ye worship ye know not what. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. But the hour cometh, and now is, when true worshipers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father seeketh such to worship him. God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. Notice verse 25. What conclusion does the woman come to from Jesus' answer? The woman saith unto him, I know that the Messiah cometh, which is called Christ. When he is come, he will tell us all things. Jesus has taken where she wanted to go down a rabbit hole and brought it back to the central conversation they were having. We may not be as good as Jesus was at that. When you're the creator of the universe, you have ways and knowledge and abilities well beyond any of ours. But sometimes we have to know when to stick, say, a stake in something, when to write a question down. One of the most important things we can have with us when studying is a piece of paper and a pen, or if it's electronic age, your iPad or phone or something to take a note on. Because if you're seeking to establish a common ground of agreement, building up the steps so that you're in the same places, you have to avoid jumping ahead. If you go too far, you're going to get into unshaky areas. And so as you move from common to uncommon ground, take it one step at a time. And don't go on until agreement at each step has been occurred, until it's happened. If your objective is simply to obtain consent for a home Bible study, avoid getting into a detailed discussion at that time. Look at some advice from Solomon. Proverbs chapter 15. Proverbs 15, verse 28. Solomon says, The heart of the righteous studieth to answer, but the mouth of the wicked poureth out evil things. That notepad and that pen, there will be questions because people have seen all the things that are on TV and the books that are out there and the movies that have been out and things that they've been taught elsewhere and this and that and the other. And they're going to say, well, what about over in Revelation? You're not studying Revelation yet. You're not studying the end of the matter. You're studying the very beginning. You just say, let's write that down and come back to it after we've established the right foundation. We got to get there. So do that. Remain steadfast to the objective. Stay on, as the military would quite often say, stay on target. And so we see it. A seventh item, the seventh principle of personal evangelism, we find within this passage, this chapter. Confront directly. Jesus' example then, look at verse 26. She has started with the idea of, we both want to drink of water. He's led her to the idea of the living water. She's jumped way on over it, and he slowed her down with, go get your husband. He's proven he's a prophet by telling her about her own past. She has come to the conclusion that that was true and jumped all the way over to worship. He's answered that, but brought her right back to the idea that God is a spirit. And she goes, well, I know there's one that's coming. Notice Jesus' answer, verse 26. When that moment came, he didn't back away. Jesus saith unto her, I that speak unto thee am he. You're waiting on the Messiah. I'm him. I want to know what to do to be saved. Here it is. Why are you waiting? Examples. Think about this as we're going through, and we might be trying to say, first, set up a Bible study with someone. Take advantage of those social contacts. Develop those common interests. Be open to comments that indicate a spiritual interest while demonstrating your own faith through actions and words. Those are what we've talked about. Avoid those fruitless arguments. Instead, emphasize common beliefs. Where you have common ground, go there and work out from it. Don't worry about things that are in the end fruitless. Praise the good points. Now, there's an important thing. When you're studying with the Bible, study the Bible. Let them draw their conclusion. And when it's a good one, praise it. Bring it out. Say absolutely. Encourage them in the right direction. Have one primary objective: to encourage them to study the Bible even more. Ask if they want to learn more about the Bible and the church. Think about an example now of that. Go to the book of Acts, Acts chapter 18. Acts 18, verses 24 through 26. Here's an example of how we go with this opportunity. And a certain Jew named Apollos, born at Alexandria, an eloquent man and mighty in the scriptures, came to Ephesus. This man was instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in the Spirit, he spake and taught diligently the things of the Lord, knowing only the baptism of John. And he began to speak boldly in the synagogue, whom when Aquila and Priscilla had heard, they took him unto them and expounded unto him the way of God more perfectly. When they have something, take that and go from there. Confront them, as we would say. You notice the 7 steps. Confront them directly with the opportunity to study the Bible. During the course of a Bible study, when we can get someone to study, when we're doing it on our own, even like tonight, continue to develop the social contact. Don't let the idea become all we can do ever together again is study the Bible. Sometimes the best way to study the Bible might be to have a small conversation and then watch something in common. Maybe it's a football game. Maybe after the game, something else will have come up, or you can have further contact, and continue to develop that social contact. Continue to establish those common interests. Just because we've now turned to the Bible doesn't mean I'm not interested in football or racing or whatever the common interest might be. Take time then to also accentuate the common ground you share. Sometimes we need to remind each other, even in the church, but especially when we're trying to study with someone, if they've come to a point that they have a common belief with us, that there is a God, for example, we just need to accentuate that. Maybe it's as simple as saying, aren't we glad there is a God in control of this world? Even in times like the world's having right now, is it not a wonderful thing that there's a God who is in charge in the end? Go then from that common ground to the uncommon ground carefully. Don't go too far too fast. Stress that gospel message. Don't obsess on individual shortcomings. Yes, we need to make sure we identify and we understand, because we quite often talk in very general terms. You can't live in sin. What is sin? Well, I've done that. Okay, that's going to happen. You're going to sin. What do we do about it? Let's go past it. Let's go to where we need to go. Don't obsess over those shortcomings. They can hold us back. Remember to have that one primary objective, to help them understand their need and that gospel plan of salvation. You can look at Mark 16, 15 and 16. How important is this need to get to salvation? Colossians 1, 5 and 6. How important is it to get to that salvation? And then at some point, as this is coming, we need to confront them directly with the invitation to obey the gospel. Our own selves, sometimes we need to ask these same kind of questions. But think about it as we're studying through this. Does this make sense? Does this look like what the Bible talks about? Is there anything that I've said or that the Bible has said that you do not understand? Have I been teaching you anything other than what the Bible teaches? And then probably one of the most important questions we can ask when someone gets to that point that they understand what the gospel's all about. Would you like to obey Christ and be baptized for the remission of your sins? Sometimes it takes us asking those direct questions. Notice the results that turn out here. We've gone down to about verse 26. Going through the rest of the same verses we did Sunday, down through 42, notice the results of this whole idea of getting a drink of water. Beginning at verse 27. And upon this came his disciples and marveled that he talked with the woman. Yet no man said, What seekest thou? Or why talkest thou with her? The woman then left her water pot and went her way into the city and said to the men, Come, see a man which told me all things that I ever did. Is not this the Christ? Then they went out of the city and came unto him. In the meanwhile, his disciples prayed him, saying, Master, eat. But he said unto them, I have meat to eat that ye know not of. Therefore said the disciples one to another, Hath any man brought him aught to eat? Jesus saith unto them, My meat is to do the will of him that sent me, and to finish his work. Say not ye, There are yet 4 months, and then cometh harvest? Behold, I say unto you, Lift up your eyes, and look on the fields, for they are white already to harvest. And he that reapeth receiveth wages, and gathereth fruit unto life eternal, that both he that soweth and he that reapeth may rejoice together. And herein is that saying true, one soweth and another reapeth. I sent you to reap that whereon ye bestowed no labor. Other men labored, and ye are entered into their labors. And many of the Samaritans of that city believed on him for the saying of the woman, which testified, He told me all that I ever did. So when the Samaritans were come unto him, they besought him that he would tarry with them, and he abode there 2 days. And many more believed because of his own word, and said unto the woman, Now we believe not because of thy saying, for we have heard him ourselves, and know that this is indeed the Christ, the Savior of the world. You notice Jesus, even in that, with his own disciples, men who had not been following him long, but had been seeing him and had known that it's about spiritual things, they're still hung up even in this physical matter because they want him to eat. And Jesus says, Well, I have meat you don't know about. And they immediately think he means that he's gotten food from someone other than them. He had, but it wasn't physical food. He's trying to get them to see that spiritual need. He draws another spiritual picture, and it's one we need to remember as we are in this time of social distancing. The contacts that we have, lift up your eyes and look on the fields, for they are white already for the harvest. Let us follow the example of Jesus. We'll pick up Sunday morning, John chapter 4, at about verse, we'll go back and look at the living water in verses 10 through 14, but then we'll pick up at verse 43. Too many lessons in this chapter. We'll be on verse 20 after that, looking at the matter of worship. So a couple of other topics that are contained within this one account that Jesus has before we move on into the end of the chapter. So the living water and worship on Sunday morning. We look forward to seeing you then.